On the night of August 12th to August 13th, 1961, the Berlin Wall was erected. In the 28 years it stood, it divided many families and restricted the freedom of the citizens of East Berlin. Could this have been prevented through more communication between the United States and the Soviet Union, or was the building of this wall inevitable due to economic conditions? It was the worst possible mix of both. As the end of World War II and victory drew nearer for the Allies, the US, United Kingdom, and USSR held multiple conferences on how to rule post-war Europe to prevent further war. At the Yalta and Potsdam conferences in spring and summer 1945, it was decided that the Allies would split Germany into 4 occupation zones until a new German government was established. In addition, in the London Protocol of September 1944, it was announced that Berlin, 100 miles into the Soviet occupation zone, would be divided amongst the Allies. Although hopes were high for post-war relations to continue between the Allies, relations soon deteriorated. In the war-torn Germany, the US and President Harry Truman sent billions of dollars for economic recovery in the Marshall Plan. They also sent money to Greece and Turkey after Britain announced stopping funding for their civil wars. The plan represented a complete reversal in foreign policy, whereas before the US tried to stay out of foreign conflicts, it now involved itself in foreign conflicts to prevent the spread of communism. With growing tensions in 1948 after the setup of the Marshall Plan and currency reform reshaping the West Berlin economy, the USSR set up a blockade of Berlin by road to force the West out of Berlin. However, the Royal Air Force and US Air Force were able to successfully supply Berlin for the duration of the blockade.
And I remember we thought we were fairly close to war, and but the delivery of those supplies to Berlin was like a big win.
The blockade, along with the formal establishment of the Federal Republic of Germany by the West and the German Democratic Republic by the Soviet Union in 1949, further increased tensions between the US and USSR.
Anyway, what became Eastern Germany was already occupied with the Soviets, and they just solidified their control over that whole area, and so it was very threatening.
As tensions continued to increase through the mid-1950s, Berlin started to become a major problem for the East. Because of the better economic conditions and freedom in West Berlin, many East Berliners defected to West Berlin and West Germany. This became a major problem as the East Berlin government lost a major portion of their workforce, especially highly skilled, educated young workers. So, in November of 1958, Premier Nikita Khrushchev issued an ultimatum for the West to leave Berlin within 6 months on the grounds that they had violated the Potsdam Agreement from 1945.
But what we kind of saw was it was the dawning of the Iron Curtain, and it was sort of like Europe being shut off from just east of Bern or Cologne. Anyway,
As a result, President Dwight D. Eisenhower held talks with Premier Khrushchev. The Soviets withdrew their deadline in May 1959 in exchange for more talks, and the Premier was even invited to the US in September. The President and Mr. Khrushchev held talks at Camp David, but all of the talks failed to produce anything more than a press opportunity. With a new, young, energetic President, John F. Kennedy, hopes were high for good relations between Khrushchev and Kennedy. The two met in Vienna, Austria for further talks on Berlin. The talks provided negative results. At the end of the Vienna conference, Khrushchev again issued another ultimatum for the West to leave Berlin within 6 months. This time, though, after Kennedy increased military expenditures, the issue was resolved with the building of the Berlin Wall. After the Berlin Wall had been built, US diplomats refused to show ID to East Berlin border guards. When the diplomats' entry was rejected, the US decided to force diplomats in using their rights and military police. On October 27th, the US conducted a test to see how far they could go, and after pushing a diplomat in, they pulled out and quickly retreated to West Berlin. This time, the Soviet Union had had enough. They deployed a group of 10 tanks to Checkpoint Charlie on Friedrichstrasse. American tanks soon arrived, and the two armies sat at stalemate for 17 hours until the conflict was resolved with back-channel communication. Could this have been prevented? What caused the building of the Berlin Wall? Many people often cite the loss of jobs as the one and only factor behind the construction of the wall. Yet if Mr. Khrushchev had communicated better with the American presidents, it is much more probable that an agreement would have been reached. In his July 25, 1961 address to the nation, John F. Kennedy said,
"Emphasize again that the choice is not merely between resistance and retreat, between atomic holocaust and surrender. Our peacetime military posture is traditionally defensive, but our diplomatic posture need not be. Our response to the Berlin crisis will not be merely military or negative. It will be more than merely standing firm."
In his address, Kennedy also announced $3.2 billion in more military funding, as well as an increase of active duty troops by over 200,000 men. Although this was aggression against the USSR, it was justified as the USSR had first provoked the US, then attempted to control its stance on Berlin. On communicating with the USSR, Kennedy said,
"If they have proposals, not demands, we shall hear them. If they seek genuine understanding, not concessions of our rights, we shall meet with them. We cannot negotiate with those who say, what's mine is mine, and what's yours is negotiable. And as Americans know from our history, on our own old frontier, gun battles are caused by outlaws and not by officers of the peace. In short..."
However, like many other things said by both the US and USSR in the Cold War, it was not the full story. According to a speech by Walter Ulbricht, head of the GDR, the West German government, and as an extension, President Kennedy, had declined to sign a peace treaty to reunite Germany into one country unless it was part of NATO, fearing Germany as a whole would fall to Soviet influence. In addition, the two West Berlin airports, Tempelhof and Tegel, did not communicate with East German air traffic controllers, which could have led to safety issues. Both sides would have benefited immensely if they had at least considered opposing ideas instead of throwing them away as Western junk or communist junk. Even though it would have been possible to prevent the Berlin Wall through diplomacy and communication, it was made harder by the loss of workers in East Berlin. After World War II, both sides of Germany were in ruins due to Allied bombing. Whilst the US poured money into Germany for revitalization, the Soviet Union took a lot of East Germany's heavy industry machines for reparations for the atrocities committed against them at battles like Stalingrad. This left the East struggling economically behind West Germany. One Indian economist who traveled to both East and West Berlin in 1960 described the difference saying, "Destruction through bombing was impartial to the two parts of the city. Rebuilding is virtually complete in West Berlin. Vacant plots are often used to raise crops. Buildings still in damaged condition are rare. The residential areas, including flats for workers of varying floor space, they are not shells. And the shopping centers radiate boom conditions. In East Berlin, a good part of the destruction still remains. Twisted iron, broken walls, and heaped up rubble are common enough sights. The new structures, including the prefabricated workers' tenants, look drab." In addition, he also described the mass emigration of East Berliners to West Berlin, saying emigration was, quote, "unabated," and saying, quote, "the largest bulk of the immigrants is within the age groups of 18 and 45. The urge to leave is greatest among technicians, professional men, and intellectuals." This crisis was born from a lack of communication. The US presidents and Mr. Khrushchev never really communicated well, and as a result, a minor dispute over the rights to Berlin almost turned into World War III at Checkpoint Charlie. The Berlin crisis and the subsequent building of the Berlin Wall was the worst possible mix of poor communication and economic conditions that forced the GDR and USSR to make rash, bold decisions. Had either talks been more in-depth and personal, or more money had been invested in East Berlin, the building of the Berlin Wall could have been prevented. Communication is and was always a viable option, and because it was not used, it contained the freedom of the citizens of East Berlin. With better communication in worldwide diplomacy, many past, present, and future problems can be mitigated.